While media, advertising, and propaganda techniques had proliferated rapidly over the prior centuries, the 20th century saw an explosive boom in state propaganda, manipulation tactics, and psychological operations. The First World War was a major turning point in this regard. Beginning in 1914, Wellington House, the War Propaganda Bureau, was established by the UK government. Wellington House existed under the Foreign Office, with the goal to influence neutral nations, particularly the United States. They would recruit prominent writers, such as H.G. Wells or Arthur Conan Doyle, to produce high-minded books and pamphlets, advocating for the British cause. And especially after sea cables were cut in the Atlantic, American information regarding what was going on the continent was increasingly limited to the United Kingdom. This gave Fleet Street media firms and Wellington House enormous say over what Americans were exposed to. During the same conflict, 3 years later in 1917, the United States would establish the Committee on Public Information. Under President Woodrow Wilson, this body would be started to sell the war after the entry. Wilson had run on a platform of staying out of war, a position which he had maintained well into the First World War on the continent. Even though the United States had decided to enter the war, to vast swaths of the population, it was still unacceptable. Thus, in the case of the United States, they didn't simply have to sell war propaganda, but had to sell war entry propaganda, justifying why their sons were dying in Europe. After the end of the war, in 1918, the Ministry of Information would be formed in Britain. The British government had realized the impact that Wellington House had, along with earlier efforts, and they would begin the Ministry of Information to pull different propagandistic bodies into one consolidated ministry, designed to coordinate news and censorship. Information in Britain was heavily censored, with a very high degree of centralized control. The British government had control over information flow, and used that to ensure that the press would adhere to national aims. That same year in the United States, Walter Lippmann would publish writings on how modern media creates pseudo-environments, the mental worlds within which the public lived, which could be constructed by the media. His writings would lay the theoretical groundwork for a great deal of opinion management theory that would come. He would argue that public opinion must be manufactured due to the complexity of the modern world, stating that the modern world was just too complex, too vast, that it must be distilled into pseudo-environments by the media, so that the people would have a simple, easily understood framework to interact with. And there would be a great burst in this field, both professionally and in the theoretical space, with the 1923 publication of Edward Bernays' Crystallizing Public Opinion serving as a significant milestone for the field. He would lay out powerful techniques in group psychology, many closely related to the works of his uncle, Sigmund Freud, arguing for techniques like appeal to authority, manipulating the desire to fit in, manipulating herd behavior, and playing to deep unconscious emotional needs, loneliness, fear, lust, or jealousy, amongst others. It was quite clear that the Anglosphere was at the top of this field, with the most sophisticated methods. The United States and United Kingdom were the kings of media and propaganda. Yet, beginning around 1919, early psychological warfare studies would be conducted in Germany. Under the Weimar government, German military theorists would develop concepts of Zersetzung, decomposition, as well as psychological defense and offense. Their primary objective was to weaken enemy morale and stability, attempting to degrade the fighting capacity of an enemy without the need for direct kinetic conflict, and they would make some quite powerful discoveries, particularly as the nation went into the Second World War. The Second World War would be a major turning point, and it would serve as a catalyst for some of the most powerful breakthroughs in state propaganda, psychological warfare, and military and intelligence tactics. In 1942, the United States would establish the Office of War Information. It was designed to coordinate wartime information and narratives. The office would produce propaganda films and works, working quite closely with Hollywood firms and figures. Unlike similar earlier efforts, It was much more heavily focused on influencing pop culture, working with Hollywood writers and filmmakers. It would embed messaging and narratives into commercial films. It would embed government messaging into radio broadcasts. It would continue using direct appeals and posters, yet its focus was quite heavily pop culture and subtlety. The aim in this regard was to influence the public subtly, so that they wouldn't realize that they were imbibing a government message. Similar to Lippmann's pseudo-environment, the idea here was for people to simply absorb it passively, and so that their own worldview, that they constructed themselves, or at least think they did, would be aligned with the wartime message. To a person consuming propaganda this way, it wouldn't feel as though the government were telling you something that they wanted you to believe. You would simply go about your day forming opinions, developing a belief about the world, and you would believe that you were doing so critically and naturally, basing it on genuine information, and organically forming pop culture. Yet all the while, the government's messaging was being subtly injected in, and the opinion that you are quite likely to form is the government's narrative. This was far more powerful than earlier endeavors, and projects like these would not end after the Second World War. Quite on the contrary, once the governments got a hold of these toys, they wanted to play with them. In 1948, the United Kingdom would establish the Information Research Department, a secret Foreign Office unit created to run anti-Soviet propaganda and to engage in counter-propaganda. You would use black and white propaganda techniques, some quite direct government messaging, which was presented at face value to the public, yet a great degree of it was deniable. Similar to American wartime propaganda, the British government would feed narratives to third-party producers of film, radio, news articles, and magazines. They would create and disseminate anti-communist, anti-Soviet materials globally, feeding stories that they wanted in the zeitgeist to journalists and editors. They would make use of front groups to make the message appear to be non-governmental. This would be termed black propaganda, and if done well, you would have no idea you were even consuming it. That same year in the United States, the CIA would begin covert operations designed to directly influence media. The CIA would back media organizations to counter Soviet gains. They would fund and direct foreign political parties and institutions, providing anti-Soviet actors money and logistical support, as well as becoming substantial financiers of media organizations. The following decades would use these effects and grow them, the whole time the primary concern being the Soviet Union. The period, particularly from the 1950s through the 1970s, would be termed the Cultural Cold War. The CIA would covertly fund and direct influential intellectuals, magazines, cultural organizations, art exhibits, and other avenues of cultural influence, which were aligned to disseminate their messaging. Some notable examples would be the magazine Encounter, the National Student Association, and abstract art exhibits. Primarily, this was done to promote Cold War aims, and to great extent, this was designed for elite opinion shaping. Intelligence agencies had observed, and correctly, that the primary drivers of what a society believes are its elite, that populations will follow the trends of their elite. This can be observed in how names change over time. Generally, upper-class women will begin seeking out new names for their children, giving them names that are initially uncommon. Yet over time, these names will filter down to the lower classes until they become common names. This is the same for fashion trends. And to great extent, intellectual beliefs begin within elite spheres and then filter out. And particularly as the elite have the overwhelming dominance on political action. If one wants to shape the beliefs of a nation and its actions, what is most important is to sculpt the minds of its elite. Particularly if one can influence the young elite, the children of the upper class, or those in elite institutions. Just think about how absolutely out of their gourd upper-class liberal arts schools on the coasts have been these past decades. They're not just nuts ideologues, they're propagandists. To give an example of the sort of person they would target, although I don't know if it's him particularly, take a look at Tom Wolfe's article, Radical Chic, That Party at Lenny's. It details the most insufferable, vapid, champagne socialists on the planet, gathering at Leonard Bernstein's house to LARP as anarcho-communist radicals. One's obsessed with the most minute details of their appearance, an obsession with seeming trendy and interesting, but not ever really rocking the boat, going so far as to invite Black Panthers into their expensive home, having their own pet parlor panther as a form of entertainment, and to show that they are favorable to the rebels. These are vapid and idiotic, pathetic figures. Yet, they have wealth. They are exposed to many others of the upper class. And they influence social trends. A self-conscious, low-agency, very visible member of the upper class is the best person for you to manipulate if you're an intelligence agency. And that they did. Beginning in the 1960s, the CIA would embark on a manipulation project, Operation Mockingbird. Now I should note that this is one of those alleged activities of the CIA. Alleged. We know they did exactly this. It's one of those. The CIA would recruit domestic and foreign journalists, as well as editors, to act as informants and publish, suppress, and modify stories. This was more of a long-standing project. Over the years of the Cold War, the government and intelligence agencies in particular had a very vested interest in controlling information. They became major sources to journalists. They would lean on editors. It got to such a point that there were major journalists who were using the agencies as their sources quite often, who were very reluctant to publish certain stories, who would make little modifications and edits, take things out here, put something else in there, all because they become reliant on the agencies, or they really didn't want to see what happened if they said no. And this wasn't one clear, organized, compartmentalized operation. This was ongoing and dispersed throughout the agencies, the military, and the government as a whole. The Cold War was geopolitical, military, diplomatic, economic, and financial. But to a truly great extent, it was informational and ideological. It was a fight between two fundamentally different worldviews, two systems of social organization. And so in order to fight that conflict, agencies and the government couldn't simply rely on the physical battlefields, whether they be in physical assets or in economic competition. But they had to rely on the ideological fight. They had to rely on information and who projected their image of themselves and the other with more convincing force. Not only for the domestic populations of these great empires, but to great extent for neutral nations. They wanted to bring neutral nations on their side, give foreign politicians justification for siding with one sphere versus the other. And while one may look at all of this and think that this is all shadowy and conspiratorial, or there's something nefarious and dark going on here, living in the realm of conjectures, of smoke-filled rooms and hand-rubbing schemers, but really, if we just step back, in an ideological war, you have to make your argument. You will use every method you can when your national defense is on the line. When you're in this level of competition, a competition of worldview, of course, these nations care about influence. It would be entirely absurd if the intelligence agencies did not engage in this. This is exactly what you would do. And for the purposes of the Cold War, it became a very significant aspect of the conflict. Beginning in the 1970s, the war on drugs in the United States would prove as another example of government messaging. This was much more overt in general, although they did continue to use covert methods. Yet this is a very interesting example, as it demonstrates a very heavy focus on pop entertainment, as well as influencing children in schools. Government messaging was everywhere during this time. Posters, after-school specials, speakers, advertisements. The war on drugs message was ubiquitous, and its scale was really quite staggering. Techniques would continue to evolve and become more sophisticated over the following decades, and particularly as the transition to digital picked up in force in the 1990s, government propaganda and manipulation would need to adapt. We will be focusing on the digital age in the next episode, But as we look back on the techniques of the 20th century, we should explore some of the methods that were developed. While we've discussed embedding stories, manipulating pop culture, manipulating thought leaders and art, there was much more going on than this, and there was an enormous burst of research happening at the agencies and militaries. So let's take a look at some of these techniques. Some they used, some they didn't, and some are quite alarming. One quite commonly used across the Anglosphere, across all government verticals, is the technique of pacing and leading. The idea here is to establish credibility and rapport by first affirming known facts or sentiments that are shared. For example, on the personal level, I begin by telling you things which you know to be true, or by stating your own opinion to you. Now credibility is established and you will trust me. I then pivot and begin giving you my narrative, the information I want you to believe. Now you will be much more inclined to believe me, as you will believe that the statement that I have given to you has a relationship to our shared beliefs, or to the facts that you already believe to be true, subconsciously associating the two as contingent. Well, we both think the same thing, so I'd better believe him on this other thing, or else that means that what we believe is wrong. Or I'd better believe him on this other fact, or else I don't know. Maybe nothing I believe is true. You find that your mind wants to believe. This was used with great regularity by the United Kingdom's Ministry of Information in the Second World War. They would work very diligently to ensure that early news was correct, demonstrating themselves to be rapid and reliable sources of information, only to then, afterward, inject their narrative. Another technique would be shock and awe, also termed rapid dominance. This would be official US military doctrine following the Cold War, in particularly the 2003 Iraq War, though not limited to that example alone. The idea is to simply use overwhelming power or displays of force to demoralize and paralyze an enemy. And this goes back to those German tactics from the 1920s we discussed earlier. People may not immediately think of this as propaganda nor manipulation, yet it is another one of these psychological effects. The goal is to demoralize. There are many different techniques which can be used to this end, yet it has been discovered that demoralization is extraordinarily powerful. You can get a very powerful opponent to simply do nothing, even if that opponent does actually have the upper hand. All you need to do is demoralize, and very often you'll find that you don't even have a fight. Domestically, arousal and desensitization would be used repeatedly and on grand scale. The idea of this technique is to use repeated exposure to specific, emotionally charged imagery or themes. For example, some threat, or something that plays at a vulnerability. This will in turn arouse anxiety. The propagandist government in turn follows this by presenting a solution which the government wants. The anxious population terrified by the threat will be quite amenable. They will see something that maybe they normally would never want to happen, but when it becomes a choice between the thing that they are alarmed by and the propagandist's solution, many will find that they simply go along, hoping to alleviate their fear. This is really just the emotional theory and technique behind creating a problem to give people the solution. And the problem doesn't have to be real either, so long as people are afraid. The final stage in this process is for the propagandist government to desensitize the population to the original threat, resolving it to be something that they no longer need to address, or they can continue to run it for as long as they need. However, desensitization will generally occur on its own. For that reason, it tends to be preferable for the propagandist government to desensitize on their own timescale, particularly if they wish to use a similar threat in the future. A prime example of this is how the Patriot Act got through. It is truly astonishing that a bunch of rugged individualists, normally inclined toward being quite libertarian, ended up waving flags for the Patriot Act. It's a simple technique, but if done well, can turn the minds of a population into nervous soup. A source of black propaganda heavily used by the United Kingdom Political Warfare Executive and the United States Office of War Information were various methods of misattribution of source. This may sound like a very simple thing, yet if done convincingly, can completely cut through a person's psychological defenses. For example, during the Second World War, the US and UK would fake German military radio. The idea here is not to place the deception on the message itself, but on the source of the message, tricking people into believing that information is coming from somewhere that it is not. This in turn causes people to 1. Interact with the message, either becoming more likely to trust it or distrust it. For example, making a lie appear to come from someone reputable if you want it trusted, or if you want people to not believe something, making it appear as though it originated from an untrustworthy source. Or 2, imbibe a message about the false source. This could be believing that the motivations of a source are different, believing that a source is more or less trustworthy than they believed prior, or believe that a source is attempting to do something. There is quite a lot that one can do with this, and it goes to show that sources are much more powerful than the lines at the end of journals, or the name underneath a headline. They can change completely how we view different actors within the world. The rally around the flag effect is an old and very powerful observation. This is a group psychological tendency that has been observed throughout time, and has been used by leaders for all of history. This is the spontaneous alignment of a social group when they feel themselves to be under attack. People will generally tend to become more hierarchical, more willing to go to extremes, more defensive of their group, more aggressive toward outsiders, and to great extent will become less thinking, entering defense mode. Examples of this would be Pearl Harbor, taking a population that absolutely wanted nothing with war, and turning them into an enormous and powerful military, immediately going to war with Japan. The Battle of Britain in the United Kingdom, solidifying sentiment against Germany during the Second World War. The proposal of Operation Northwoods, the idea of the government faking an attack on a passenger plane, thus to turn the population in line with government aims, unifying them against national enemies. Or the most recent large-scale one, 9/11, creating a burst of energy for the global war on terror. One technique which we discussed before is targeting opinion leaders. Generally, the government will identify the influential and will use them as knowing or unwitting conduits for their messaging. This was the core strategy of the CIA's Cultural Cold War, for example using artists via the Congress of Cultural Freedom. People tend to be more inclined to trust those who they like, want to be like, or feel some sort of loyalty to. If you are receiving a message from somebody that you look up to, perhaps your favorite musician, perhaps your professional hero, or perhaps someone who epitomizes what you want to be like, then you will be extremely susceptible to their messaging, letting your guard down in a way you never would when information is clearly coming from government propaganda. One technique which is extremely ubiquitous today is astroturfing, also termed pseudo-grassroots. We see this all the time on the internet today, creating stories and narratives that appear to be organic, but really are synthetic in origin. One very clear example was used in the Iraq War. The US military would write news articles that they wanted to be published within local Iraqi newspapers. They would pass these on to Iraqi journalists and editors, and they would in turn publish them. To the local populations in Iraq, they believed that these articles were coming from true, third-party, non-biased, and reliable sources. Yet all the time, they were reading US military propaganda. Information and narratives that they thought were genuine in origin, that they thought were grassroots, that they trusted, were really just the military giving them a message. There are no grassroots. It's astroturf. Going deeper into more personal psychology and some of the research conducted particularly in the mid-century, A technique of dissociation was found to have very powerful manipulative effects. The technique of dissociation is where one is psychologically destroyed by systematically disrupting one's personal, professional, and social life without being overt. This is a technique which began to be documented in the German military experiments, Zersetzung. There are some awful but darkly comedic examples of this being used by US intelligence. For example, say there's somebody that you believe to be a liability, but you don't want to physically do anything, and you don't want to be overt. You could instead systematically pick apart the guy's life, making him lose his mind. Perhaps you start laying doubts in his marriage, giving him and his wife little bits of information to make them distrust each other. Perhaps you start stealing some mail, so he misses some bills and gets into a rough financial situation. Perhaps you find a way to drain his bank account. Maybe he's charged with a crime. Nothing major, but enough that it just starts eating away at him, bit by bit, breaking apart his life. Another element of this that had incredible effect, and this is where it becomes darkly comedic, is visibly stalking someone. Say you have been involved with the government, and now you are in the crosshairs of the intelligence agencies. While the CIA is doing all of this messing with your life, you start to see guys in vans parked outside your house. You see a camera in one of your rooms. You start to hear strange sounds. You see cars following you. And this is not the agents being sloppy. This is them wanting you to see them, so that you know you are being followed. The effect of this is, of course, the paranoia of it all, but also the additional deleterious effect of trying to explain this to anyone. On the one hand, it's psychologically exhausting to try to keep this to yourself. But if you were to go to someone and start telling them about how the CIA is following you, well, that's just a whole different problem, because you will get, okay, there's just no win. It's a great way to knock out an enemy, leaving no marks. The group psychology technique of the bandwagon effect and social proofs. This technique is used all the time. We see this every day. The idea here is to make one believe something, or at least to functionally believe something, by convincing him that everyone around him believes it, appealing to one's desire to fit in and fear of ostracism, or to cause doubts, making one think, well, it's only me? Maybe I'm wrong. This would be done at grand scale in the Vietnam War. US military and intelligence would broadcast messages to the Viet Cong, sneak information to them, send undercover sources, various techniques to get information to the enemy, and convince them that their compatriots are surrendering, convince them that their leadership knows they can't win, that everyone knows this is doomed, they all are giving up, no one wants to do this anymore, why don't you just quit? But this can also be used in the political domain. This can be used in advertising. This doesn't even have to be untrue. For example, during the early days of home computers, advertising that everyone is getting a home computer, and you need to, or else you won't know how to use a home computer. Your children will be far behind. Now, at the time, they couldn't know for sure that that was true, although in retrospect that is true. Everyone does need to use a computer. But it's this, everyone else is doing it. Everyone else thinks this. Everyone else doesn't like this. Well, nobody would do that. It's quite effective. Getting a bit darker, we look at some of the techniques that were developed by military and intelligence, particularly for interrogation techniques. Many techniques that were developed to psychologically manipulate prisoners were found to have social, psychological, and propagandistic applications. Sensory deprivation and sensory overload. These are two sides of the same coin. The idea is to manipulate one's environment, either by subjecting them to too much stimulus or giving them too little, attempting to make them break. Many innovations in these techniques were developed by the Chinese communists, techniques later researched by Western intelligence, and it would be used in great force during the global war on terror. Perhaps you could fill their room with bright light, blasting it with sound all the time. They can never rest. They can't even really think. They're completely overwhelmed and they break down. Or conversely, something that we see in prisons all the time. Put them in a quiet, small room with nothing inside. No light, no activity, nothing. Just silence and the four walls. Eventually, your own mind becomes the thing which torments you. Around the same time and on the same track, techniques designed to induce learned helplessness would become quite common. Methods and study around learned helplessness go back a great deal further, yet it would be heavily studied by intelligence and military. The overall model of these techniques is to subject a target to unpredictable and uncontrollable stressors. Eventually, they will become passive, and they will lose their will. Examples of this include seer training and the techniques used in Abu Ghraib. There are so many ways to go about this. This could be more physical, for example, sleep deprivation, proving to a subject that they have no say over their environment. Frequently, this was done by waterboarding during the War on Terror. It could also be quite psychological, for example, the ego down technique, a technique which quite notably was being studied and inflicted on Ted Kaczynski, something documented about him which appears to have been a psychological stressor event for the man who would become the elusive bombing hermit. As a student, he was involved in research, attempting to understand learned helplessness. Ego down refers to the psychological method of breaking down one's sense of self, tearing apart everything that one believes in oneself, tearing down one's beliefs, self-confidence, getting someone to such a point of self-doubt that they won't even bother to try to resist. This overlaps to a great extent with no-touch tortures. Examples could be forcing prisoners into stress positions, hooding, prolonged periods of standing, sensory overload, sensory deprivation, like solitary confinement. There are so many ways that one could affect this. The idea is simple: cause someone tremendous distress without the need for physical traumas. Techniques like this were used quite frequently in the global war on terror, as well as the Royal Army in Northern Ireland. Along with the growth and sophistication of manipulation techniques, governments dedicated resources to psychological study and psychological analysis, attempting to understand the minds of people and groups on a deeper level, and to find ways to map the psyche. The idea of psychopolitical analysis would emerge. This method is to develop a thorough psychological model of a target in order to predict and manipulate. It became evident that while many of these techniques are universal, they are not equally as useful across all people, nor across all groups. If one wanted to have the most effect, then one would need to develop an accurate model of how one thinks, tailoring the techniques in each individual case. This would greatly increase the effectiveness of these methods. A great deal of these techniques would be done primarily in media. For example, the termed propaganda model is the method of controlling and manipulating official sources. We see this today with the idea of trusted sources. There are always going to be so many people sharing so many ideas, particularly as information technology has proliferated so vast. There is no way to truly control the informational field. Yet, for the most part, if one can control the trusted official sources, at least throughout the 20th century, this is functionally control over the informational field, directing people to trusting certain sources which are manipulated by the government. There are different ways to go about this, but what it highlights is that when observing the informational field, one should pay particular attention to the official and institutionally trusted sources. Tying this in with psychopolitical analysis, this sort of method has much greater effect when one uses target audience analysis. In this form of analysis, one breaks populations into specific groups, identifies vulnerabilities, motivations, cultural sensitivities, and communication networks to ensure that messaging is effective and efficient. For example, instead of simply layering stories into the media of an environment, one could inject different versions of the same story into different sources. Say a government were trying to convince its population that it should go bomb the ocean. Instead of simply running the same story across different media, one could perhaps use an emotional appeal in media targeting women, or frighten them into believing that the ocean was a threat to children, in the case of young mothers. One could go to the working classes, saying that the ocean was undercutting them. One could go to young men and create valiant depictions of brave, heroic figures slashing at the ocean with swords telling them how much a grand adventure it would be. This doesn't even just have to be a change in core informational content. Different moods, different themes, different imagery, but at its core, it's tailor your message. And the techniques that have been developed to understand what needs to be tailored and what affects whom have become quite remarkably sophisticated. So much of the media sphere that has existed since the 20th century is so heavily dependent on manipulating the unconscious. We've seen this going back to Bernays, and in more crude forms earlier than that. Propagandists play to people's fears and desires, to their base needs and wants, to their fear of ostracization, to their desire to be loved, and the effect that these techniques have had in aggregate are very powerful herding behavior, which in turn reinforces the propagandistic message. People are manipulated on multiple vectors. Perhaps they accept a message because of fear, and on the other hand, they observe those around them who have also been manipulated by the same propaganda. In turn, they become afraid of being alienated. They double down on the message, and because this fear is so present, they begin policing themselves. Now, a propagandistic message can be imparted into a group, and when adopted, they will become the most fanatical enforcers of it. The propagandist no longer needs to propagandize, as the group itself is the enforcement mechanism. They may even continue the story, adding new elements and increasing the appeals, making it more and more effective. That's what the 20th century really brought about. Certainly, it's the mass proliferation, it's the sophistication, it's the staggering power of television, having only a few channels that everyone in your nation watches. But more than that, it's the self-perpetuating propaganda. This has always existed in some form or another in societies, but as the techniques of manipulation became so sophisticated on the parts of governments in the 20th century, the self-policing and self-enforcement of their societies made the liberal democracies of the 20th century among the most totalitarian to ever exist. There have certainly been other quite totalitarian systems, and there have been many that are much more overtly authoritarian. Yet nearly all societies before have had a higher degree of internal dissent, even if kept secret. For example, in the Soviet Union, there was an understanding that so much of what the government claimed was just not true. While people wouldn't overtly say it, or go out complaining about the government, there were little jokes, little indications, and there was just common understanding, even among those who largely supported the system. We pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. And one may look at the Soviet Union and say, but that was so much more brutal. Sure, but brutality has nothing to do with the level of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism just means that the system is totalizing. How much of one's life the systems and beliefs of the system extend into. The enormous power that liberal democracies have is that it uses social proofs as its own justification. Say you exist in an authoritarian society. There is a dictator. No one votes, you have no say. If people are upset with the leader, they may say so. They may band together and attempt to form an army to overthrow him. And their greatest risk is that the dictator's forces will defeat them. Perhaps like some medieval kingdom, a group of the barons band together to pick a new king. Yet in the 20th century liberal democracy, because they can argue that the system is based on the will of the governed, though of course it is not, and it is still ultimately mostly within the domain of the ruling class, people will be much more afraid to oppose it to that level. It can be argued that the system is the will of the people, that the rulers are the will of the people, that this is democratic. And as people imbibe that belief, they become the enforcers of the legitimacy of the system. As opposition to the fundamentals of the system becomes anti-social. For example, opposing the voting mechanism, being anti-liberal, not believing in the foundational stories around the Second World War, or the foundational documents of the Civil Rights era. It becomes such that truly opposing the system is something which is socially unacceptable and is self-policed. Really opposing the system, really opposing its philosophy, is immoral. That is so powerful. The ability to propagandize and perpetuate the sense of legitimacy of the system that exists within Western liberal democracies is nearly totalizing. You vote, you campaign, you put up the sign in your yard, and you have legitimized the system. Everyone is made to feel as though they are a piece of the system, even if in reality possessing very little agency and no real say in what actually happens. Because that level of buy-in exists, and the foundation story is that this is a system of the people, the will of the people. People can't oppose it because they will be opposing their friends, their neighbors. They will be an enemy of the people. Thus, as everyone realizes this and knows that they can't be an enemy of the people, they will enforce the liberal right to rule story at every turn. They will enforce the foundation myths. They will enforce the legitimacy of the system, and they will be the regime's greatest enforcers. It's easy to see when the ideology of the state is imbued into everything in another society, but can be quite difficult to see in one's own. Through the 20th century and into the 21st, every single aspect of one's life became imbued with the ideology of the liberal state. Everything was an extension of the right to rule story and the legitimization of the regime. People came to regurgitate beliefs that they knew to be untrue. And why? Why would they do that? Because they knew that they had to imbue the liberal story in everything. Because if the liberal philosophy that justifies the system is not true in one regard, then it is not true anywhere. And that becomes quite frightening for people. People will resist this, not because they feared reprisal from the state, but from each other. They feared everyone else who would be the enforcer of the story. That is the power of state propaganda in the 20th century. Before we end this chapter, we should look at some of the research projects themselves, particularly as the story of MKUltra has become quite legendary. Turning our attention to MKUltra, a mid-century CIA project whose name people use as an umbrella term for many similar projects around the same time, was at its core psychological research. The main fundamental aim was enhanced interrogation, attempting to discover different techniques at extracting information. There would be different side projects during this endeavor, and what was discovered would have far-reaching implications. Intelligence researchers would particularly make use of psychoactive drugs. They would use amphetamines, although these turned out to not give that much information, yet began to find some progress when they began investigating barbiturates, as well as other GABAergic hypnotics. They were attempting to affect controllable amnesia, the ability to turn on and off memory creation. They would experiment with many techniques, including sensory deprivation, sensory stimulus, verbal and psychological abuse, hypnosis and suggestion, electroshock therapy, sleep deprivation, induced sleep. And as this research went on, they began to find different avenues to explore. They would look into implanting memories, attempting to induce people to take actions without being aware of it, nor having memory of it. They would begin studying extrasensory perception as well, something which would particularly pick up in army research in the 1980s. They would explore neurotoxins, cannabinoids, oral cyclohexylamines, alcohol, benzodiazepines. Yet they would really begin to be excited when they came across lysergamides and tryptamines. Beginning in the 50s, they would begin conducting enormous slates of research on tryptamines, phenethylamines, and particularly lysergamides. The one they seemed to really have an affinity for was LSD. Most of their research would be outsourced, funding researchers and universities, yet they would also do some of it themselves. They would conduct an enormous amount of research on the effects of LSD and what they could do with it, some of it getting quite wild, including the now famous Operation Midnight Climax, which included viewing dosed subjects with prostitutes from behind a two-way mirror. Other projects which people often lump in with this would include the 1950 Project Bluebird, an effort to control the minds of foreign agents, remove memories, and install new personalities. The research on this would particularly be conducted with hypnosis and drugs. Project Artichoke, beginning 1951, the successor to Bluebird, which focused on information extraction, and is where the agency began to look into controlled amnesia. Yet perhaps the earliest form of this sort of research is the 1947 Project Chatter, a Navy research endeavor attempting to engage in information extraction via truth drugs. Over time, the techniques investigated by intelligence and military research would touch so many different areas, many of them going outside of the more materialist confines that people tend to think in. There would be ideas taken from world religions and spiritual systems from around the world, from philosophies throughout all of history, and a great number of these officials were themselves quite inclined toward the more mystical. Particularly in the 1980s, there would be a great degree of research into extrasensory perception, particularly through a method of remote viewing. There would be many studies in this vein, attempting to see if subjects could identify objects and locations of strategic importance across the world. For example, attempting to gain information about a Soviet missile silo. They would as well look into things like telekinesis. The most substantial of this research would be the U.S. Army's 1977 Project Stargate, overseen by Major General Albert Stubblebine. A comedy film based around this research was released in 2009, Men Who Stare at Goats. Yet beyond this, many of the techniques being researched were much more subtle. For example, identity fracturing, the idea being that if somebody is subjected to sufficient trauma, particularly if a subject is made to do heinous acts that they do not want to do, ones which cause a breakdown in sense of self, and particularly if this is induced in somebody quite young, then the subject will fragment his or her identity to deal with it, ultimately causing an effect much like multiple personality, where different parts of their self become compartmentalized, blocking bits of themselves off from others. The full extent to which this has been investigated and conducted is difficult to ascertain, as by its nature, it is extremely brutal and heinous. There are many people who claim to have been subject to this sort of research, and to these techniques employed for espionage purposes. And while it's very difficult to know who is telling the truth, who actually was involved, it does appear evident that at least some were. And at the core of it, this method is ultimately induced trauma, causing a subject to commit horrors, breaking apart the subject's sense of self, and compartmentalizing the psyche in order to deal with it. Yet many techniques are not so dark, and many of them are done on large scale. For example, false duality, asserting that there are two dichotomous options and only two dichotomous options. One technique that you will notice everywhere if you begin to look for it is if not X then Y. Very simply, painting two things as a dichotomy and forcing people to choose one. Well, either you like the neoliberal free market system as it exists, or you are a Marxist socialist. Those are the two. It's either the free system or it's the socialist system. Pick one. It is alarmingly effective. People will very easily double down on things they don't even fully believe because they are attempting to avoid association with the then option. This is an element of forced framing, something which we tangentially referenced earlier, causing people to build their own entire worldview, forcing people to see things in certain ways. In many types of manipulation, it's not the core informational content itself which is the goal. It's causing people to build a frame through which they view the world, causing people to buy into stories. For example, causing people to become regime enforcers because they believe that if they were to oppose some element somewhere, then that would undermine a core story, an element of philosophy, which would in turn break something that they hold dear. This could be done through something as small as simple language construction. For example, attempting to force a sharp wedge between the notions of democracy and populism, which are ultimately describing the same thing, the demos and the populi. It's just Latin and Greek. Yet, the emotional associations between the two cause people to believe that there's a difference between the high-minded notion of the will of the people when it is done through the liberal democratic method, Or the dumb and simple will of the people, when the people start doing things. The dumb people who can't be in charge of themselves. One quite impressive and elegant technique can be observed in late-night TV comedy. This technique is specifically designed for low information people, yet people who may be susceptible to self-aggrandizement. The method is quite simple. If somebody is not high information, and particularly if he is self-conscious about that on some level, then you explain an idea to that person using very curated information and forced perspectives, keeping the entire frame highly constrained, and simultaneously present a simplified straw man, omitting a great degree of information, as a caricature of an opposing argument, claiming that this is what the opponents believe, though that not actually being the case. Then, using derisive comedy, put down the theoretical opponent. The low information viewer now feels himself to be very intelligent because he sided with the presenter. Well, I must be very smart, because I followed that argument and I agree. I'm not like those cretins who think the other thing. He must aggrandize himself and believe an argument, even without actually knowing any of the facts, and must put down those who disagree, because if not, he must acknowledge to himself his own lack of information. He becomes stuck believing an argument he doesn't even understand, because the alternative is that he becomes the butt of his own joke. Ha! Can you believe people who think something different? It's like making an argument, look, we support this healthcare policy, because quite obviously, healthcare is good. And if we use our policy, then more people will get more health. Everything better will happen with our idea. And can you get a load of these guys? There are these other guys saying, actually people should die. Pause for laughs. Yeah, can you believe it? There are people who actually think that we should just be killing everyone. You can tell the other millennials, this is your opinion. This really only works on very low information narcissists. And that's why the late night TV guys make a lot of money. You find that you must buy into the argument, because at the same time, it's the only argument you've ever heard, you don't know the actual information, and now you have pegged your own sense of your own intelligence and moral superiority to having followed the argument and bought into it, while also denigrating and mocking people who disagree on grounds that you don't know anything about. Look, all I'm saying is I believe that we should do good things, and I hate those idiots who think we should do bad things. Now, you might think that that's awful, and that this sort of propaganda is deleterious. But a very troubling truth is that it doesn't matter. What most people think does not matter. Most of the population, they could love the system, hate the system. They could believe in one thing or another, like one politician or another. It doesn't matter. For the overwhelming majority of the population, what they believe has no effect at all on what happens. So, what is the point of all this then? Well, there are two things. One, there is some share of the population who do have informational agency and can affect things. It's very important to manipulate them. For example, going back to manipulating those within the elite, and particularly the young elite. And more than that, there is a certain level to which the general population must have buy-in. What a ruling class does, and what a ruling class is concerned with, isn't the particular beliefs of the general population. Most modern manipulation is designed to distract. They can even be feeding information designed to make people hate the ruling faction, so long as it leads nowhere, so long as it just causes fighting, exhaustion, makes people spend all day watching the TV or scrolling through their phone, especially if it makes them fight with people, if it makes them scared or anxious. The entire point is just to waste time. Why? Well, because attention is a very important resource. And if you can get someone going down rabbit holes and pulling on threads that go nowhere, then you have destroyed that time. And there's one thing that's dangerous to a ruling class. The population does not have to like them, but they must believe that the system is real. That is the one thing that must be maintained. You do not have to like the system. You do not have to believe in the system as a good entity. You do not have to believe in the system's vision. You do not even have to want to be a part of it. But you must believe that it is real. You must believe that it is valid enough so that you keep operating the machines. A ruling class does not fear that the little people will all rise up and overthrow them. That isn't going to happen. But what is frightening is that they will stop operating the machinery, that they will stop buying, and that it will simply stop running. And so, to great extent, having people running down rabbit holes, having people being worked up and fighting online, even making people purposefully angry about the ruling class itself, just keeps them busy. It's just entertainment. So watching those regime programs, watching those late-night TV comedians, is, on the social order, no different from watching football. It has no difference at all in terms of the society. Further to the point of the more spiritual, mystical, and philosophical end of things, spirit itself has been explored to great effect, attempting to manage the spiritual inclinations of the population. Ruling powers have attempted to influence the religiosity of their populations, and to assert the belief in the system, the order's philosophy as a religion unto itself. Manipulation of the notions of masculine and feminine have also yielded enormous effect, as ideas taken from very old philosophical systems like alchemy have been thoroughly researched and utilized. The much more fundamental ideas of the divine masculine and feminine, the yin and yang, if one can manipulate those, particularly by constant juxtaposition and subversion between the two, then there's a lot you can do with someone's mind. For example, this was used on a macro level to great effect via government agencies, media, and social organizations attempting to play men and women off each other during the course of the sexual revolution. But this can also occur more psychologically, attempting to align something that someone associates as feminine with masculine, or associate something that one associates with masculine with feminine, playing them off each other. Those two notions are so fundamental to how people think and exist in the world, as they're notions that appear to be fundamental to the universe itself, a constant repeating pattern, that if you can manipulate how one thinks about them, there's really no limit to what you can manipulate. The psychological transformation of the magnum opus has as well been used, the process of going inward and undergoing self-transformation. This again ties with the divine masculine and feminine ideas, or the yin and yang. If you guide a group psychologically along this path, yet divert it at a point, you can cause people to undergo transformations that they didn't wish to have. This also connects with ideas that we talked about when referencing Carl Jung in the first episode. There is so much depth in the mind, and it gets really arcane and ethereal at a point, as the reality of our minds is that we really don't fully know them. People can be played with paradoxicality, intentionally causing people to accept a contradiction. For example, forcing people to specifically declare their belief in the most unbelievable elements of a system. Thus, by recognizing the paradoxicality and by becoming a proponent themselves, that resolves every other element that is incongruent in their minds. You become a stronger enforcer of the rest of the belief system. In fact, 20th century research got to such a point that one can make someone think himself insane, getting someone stuck in an infinite paranoid loop, going back to that disassociation idea from earlier, making people get caught up in infinite looping paradoxicality. The mind is very malleable. During the period of MK Ultra research, the government would fund Dr. Ewan Cameron out of McGill. He would use drugs to induce comas. He would subject his unconscious subjects to stimuli, such as constant repetitive sounds. The effect that he found was that he was able to induce amnesia. He was able to bring on a state that was indistinguishable from Alzheimer's. He broke people's minds. It can be done. Yet, perhaps one of the most alarming avenues to manipulation is one of the most commonplace. It is extremely easy to manipulate a population via vices. We now live in an age where extremely dangerous drugs are everywhere. We live in an age where hardcore pornography is available to anyone, where so many young men have sports betting apps on their phones, and where every young woman has the discussion of, should I start posting videos of myself? An environment like that is very easy to manipulate, for as people become more enslaved to their vices, they will find that they are less resistant in other places. And going back to that idea of you just need the population to buy in on a pretty basic level, if people are controlled by their vices, they will never challenge the system. They will never truly leave. Unless, of course, they are so enslaved by their vices that they drop out of everything, in which case, the system has a perfectly working institution designed to profit off of them. The 20th century was the greatest triumph of propaganda ever. The sheer power of the manipulation techniques that were developed are, even saying them, they sound difficult to believe. They're so powerful. And as we explore the digital age in the next episode, and we see just how much more messy things became after the internet became the main source of information, we will find that the core of social strife right now is informational, that the conflicts, the anxieties, the provocations to insanity are so deeply rooted in the informational field. The largest companies in our world are information companies. The most powerful parts of the government are the information agencies. We have entered an age where the most valuable asset is not gold, it's certainly not currency, and it's not even the fundamental natural resources. It's information. We exist in a fascinating age where the truly unique idiosyncrasies of human psychology are fully on display. We are information processing creatures in an informational universe, and as we go forward, we will see that an informational war is just as real as one on a battlefield with guns.